Hey, this is Aaron Rabinowitz for CreativeCow.net. Okay, welcome to part 3 of my weather replacement tutorial where I'll be showing you how to make a day go from bad to worse. Oh, I'm really good at that. I figure it's time that I should take that into the digital world. Okay, we're back on our main composition, and I'm going to turn off my tree layer so that I can work with my background a bit. I'll just click on the tree's eyeball switch, which shuts them off. Okay, with that done, it's time to start lighting things up. When lightning flashes, it lights up the sky around it. Even before it strikes the ground and is visible, lightning moves above the cloud layers, lighting them up. So let's create some cloud light up. Let's add a new solid by choosing Layer, New, Solid. And in the solid settings, let's name it Cloud Flash 1. Then in the color chooser, set the color to a bluish gray. I'll use the settings R equals 107, G equals 116, and B equals 130. This is important because my sky has a slight tint of blue in it, but if it were wholly gray, you might do better by using a solid at 50% gray. That's where the RGB settings are all at 128. Anyway, click OK to confirm the color, and then back in the solid settings, make sure the solid is the same size as the composition, and then click OK to confirm the creation of the new solid. Next, I'm going to set its opacity down a bit by selecting the layer in the timeline and hitting T to reveal the opacity. And then I'll set the opacity value to 50%. Next, with the new solid selected, I'll activate the Oval Mask tool. And then in the comp window, I'll create an oval mask. And then once I do that, I'll scale it and place it over a small area of the clouds. Ideally, you want to find an area of the clouds that stands out from other parts of it, where the shape is a little more differentiated. Next, in the timeline, I'll change the solid layer's transfer mode from normal to add. Right. Now this area of the clouds is lit up. It's totally fake looking because it's a perfect oval shape over fluffy clouds, but hang in there. With the solid selected, choose Effect, Stylize, Roughen Edges. And then in the Effects panel, I'll set the Effects border property up to 25. Not looking too great yet, but we're getting there. Next, with the Cloud Flash layer still selected, choose Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Blur. And then in the Effects panel, set the blurriness property up a bunch. I'd say that this will be good somewhere between 15 and 20. At this point, you need to eyeball it a bit. Playing with the mask's size and position is part of the process, and eventually you'll find something that works. Now, I want to do some quick opacity animation here. I'm going to move to frame 10 in the timeline, and I'll add a keyframe by clicking on the opacity keyframe stopwatch, and then I'll set the opacity to 0. Then I'll move down to frame 14 and set it to 40. Then to frame 17, and I'll set that to 25. And then you know what? Let me just make this simple. These numbers are meaningless because in your project, the values and timing could be entirely different. If you look at this graph, you can see what I'm going for here. An undulating opacity buildup and then a series of flashes at an opacity of 55% and then out to 0 very soon thereafter. By the way, this chart was done with Data Animator, a plugin from Digital Anarchy. It can take tab-delimited text files with statistical or financial or frankly any data and convert it into animated graphs and pie charts. Okay, once I have all of my animation keyframes put in there, I can do a quick preview, and as you can see, we have a flashing cloud. Now let's duplicate this cloud layer by hitting Control D or Command D if you're on a Macintosh, and then let's rename it by hitting Enter. I'll name it Cloud Flash 2. Then I'll play with the mask size and position so that I can light up an adjacent cloud area. Once that's done, I'll move its opacity keyframes down about 8 frames. That'll be frame 18 in this project. Then I'll do it all again for this bigger cloud area. I'll duplicate the Cloud Flash layer and name it Cloud Flash 3 if it hasn't automatically updated the name. Then I'll move and scale its mask as we've been doing. Once done, I'll move its opacity keyframe down about 11 frames, which brings my first opacity keyframe to frame 29. Okay, this last cloud flash layer that we made will be where the lightning comes from, and I want the light to come up a little and then disappear over a slightly longer time. So I'm going to add 2 extra opacity keyframes. At the 1 second and 25 frame mark, I'll set the opacity back up to 30. And then 10 frames later, at 2:05, I'll set it to 0 again. A quick RAM preview and I can see my clouds all lighting up. Alright, now it's time to add the lightning. I'm going to move over to a point in time where my main cloud here is lit up, just so I can see what I'm working with. Frame 109 should do it. Let's add a new solid by choosing Layer, New, Solid. I'll set the name of the solid to Lightning, and then I'll make sure the solid is the same size as the composition. The color of the solid doesn't matter, so don't worry about it. Then click OK to confirm the creation of the new solid. Now, with the solid selected, choose Effect, Generate, Advanced Lightning. As you can see, we have some lightning, which in its current state looks like Emperor Palpatine is really angry at the water. But let's assume that the lightning is not being generated through the power of the dark side of the Force, and is instead being generated by the forces of nature. In that case, we're going to need to do a little bit of work here. In the Effects panel, set the lightning type property to Strike. This allows us to use the direction controller to determine the strike point. So in the composition window, I'll set the lightning's origin point to the center of our big cloud here, and then set the strike point to the water about here. Again, like many aspects of this project, it needs to be eyeballed. Anyway, when I'm done with that, I need to change the look of the actual bolt of lightning. So I'll go into the Effects panel and I'll twirl down the core settings. For the core radius property, I'll set the value down to 0.6. For the core color, I'll click on the color swatch, and in the core color dialog, I'll set it to a mid to light gray, maybe with RGB values set to about 187 or so. Once I have that, I'll click OK to get out of the color dialog. Next, I'll twirl down the glow settings, and I'll set the glow radius down to 20, and the glow opacity down to 30. Also, I'll set the glow color to a much darker color. Using the color chooser, I'll borrow one of the greenish-gray midtones from the background, maybe from the water. I may need to adjust that later. Next, I'll set the lightning's turbulence down just a little bit. I'll set it to 0.9. Visually, it seems like a minor difference, but that's only while the bolt is standing still. When the bolt is moving, turbulence can create wildly varied shapes. I'm just taking steps to get it under control. Bringing it down even this little can help a lot. Also, I'll set the forking property to 100%. This will make the lightning bolt fork, or rather split, not to be confused with fork splitting, which you do with English muffins. Am I the only one who has trouble doing that? They always break apart when I try that. Oh, Mr. Thomas, what were you thinking? Wow, that was about as off topic as it gets. Okay, back on track. Let's animate the lightning bolts a bit. In the timeline, move to 1 second and 5 frames. And then, back in the Effects panel, let's set a keyframe for the direction property. Then let's move down 10 frames to 1 second and 15 frames, and move the direction ever so slightly to the right, maybe 10 pixels. Making this change creates a variance in the lightning bolt's shape over time, and it also adds another keyframe as well. Alright, just a few more touches to the lightning itself. At this point, the lightning bolt is looking a little alias to me. Yeah, that's fancy talk for sharp pixelation at the edges. I have to use words like that so I sound like I know what I'm talking about, so just ignore it. Anyway, I'll fix that up by adding a slight blur. With the lightning layer selected, choose Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Blur. Then in the Effects panel, set the blurriness property to 1. Yep, just 1 pixel of blur will do it. Finally, in the timeline, let's set the lightning layer's transfer mode from normal to screen. This gives a slight additive effect, but not nearly as additive as the add transfer mode, which could be a bit too drastic in this case. Now, remember 15 seconds ago when I said finally? I was kidding. One more thing. Let's animate the opacity. Okay, this is going to be another one of those case-by-case basis things, so I'm going to jump ahead in time to show you what I did here with regard to animating the opacity of the lightning. At frame 0, I have a hold keyframe with a value of 0. Then at frame 35, I have a keyframe with a value of 100% opacity, which means that until frame 35 there is no lightning showing, and then at frame 35 it appears. After that, I've added keyframes at frame 37, 40, 43, and 45, alternating between 50 and 100% opacity. At frame 47, I've also added a keyframe with a value of 0 to make the lightning disappear. If I graphed it out, it would look something like this. A quick RAM preview and it's looking good, but there are a few things that I can do to give it some more realism. When the lightning flashes, it should light up the water around it, and frankly, the water should be reflecting the light from the clouds too. So what I'll do is select the Cloud Flash 3 layer, and I'll duplicate it by hitting Ctrl D. Then I'll rename the layer to Water Flash, and then once I'm done with that, I'll adjust the sizing and position of the mask by dragging it down to the water and playing with the mask dimensions a bit. Once that's done, you may want to blur it out more. So I'll go into the effects panel and I'll set its blurriness up to 30. This is a judgment call, obviously. Okay, really last step. When lightning moves through the clouds and eventually strikes, everything lights up. The sky, the trees, the rain, the ground, or in this case, the water. So let's light up the skies, shall we? Let's add a new adjustment layer by choosing Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. Then go right back up there and choose Effect, Color Correction, Levels. Okay, this next little bit is more conceptual than practical, but bear with me and hopefully I can give you what you need here. If I go into the effects panel and play with my input white value, as you can see, this brightens up the scene. This happens because, thanks to my adjustment layer, every layer below it has the effect applied to it. What we need to do here is light up the sky when the lightning strikes. So at frame 10, just before our first cloud lights up, I'll click on this stopwatch to set a keyframe for the level's histogram property. Then I'll move down to frame 19 where I'll bring up the input white value just slightly. Technically, it's bringing the input white value down, not up, so maybe I'll set it down to 200. Then I'll move down 5 or 6 frames in the timeline, and I'll set it back to 255. Then I'll move down in time to 1 second and 5 frames, the first frame of our lightning bolt, and I'll set the input white values down to 92, which really lights up the scene. Then I'll move down 2 frames to 107 and drop out the effect a bit. Then I'll move down 3 frames and I'll really light things up, bringing the input white value down to 78. And I'll keep doing this, having the light build up quickly and then gradually fading out. If I were to graph this out as percentages of input white, because that's actually how After Effects looks at the numbers, it might look something like this, keeping in mind that when the graph dips down, the composition is actually getting brighter. Oh, and at the end, I have an extra spike of light. Even when we don't see a bolt of lightning, maybe because it's above the bottom cloud layer or perhaps behind us, the sky does light up, so that's a little extra for effect, not necessary. Okay, just turn the trees back on, and then do a quick RAM preview, and we can see it looking good. We have some nice lightning and also complementary lighting, which gives a more natural look. Even the branches are being lit up. Nice. Just to remind you, this is where we started, and this is our end result. Some final words of advice here. I think that when people try doing an effect like this, their inclination is to do something obvious, meaning, look how cool this lightning looks, isn't it cool? But when it comes to recreating nature in some way, be it fire, water, lightning, etc., the goal is to make it as unremarkable as possible. We see these things often enough that if it doesn't look real, we can tell right away, so keep that in mind when you try to create natural effects. Okay, I hope this has given you some insight into the process of creating lightning. Once again, this is Aaron Rabinowitz for CreativeCow.net. Now where is my umbrella?